Order. I call Sir Geoffrey Cox to move the motion.
It's a great pleasure to have been able to secure a debate under your presidency this afternoon, and I'm extremely grateful to the Minister for attending. With exquisite timing, the Conservative Party has managed to list an Opposition Day motion in the main chamber on exactly the same subject tomorrow. And while I welcome that, perhaps I also welcome the opportunity of having the Minister much more up close and personal than we normally have in the main chamber, in what I hope will be a relatively civilised debate, perhaps not always something we have always in the main chamber, although one would hope so, to discuss not the general questions that affect the entire country in connection with farming, but questions most specific to Devon, though of course they share common themes and common subjects. The Minister will know, although I forget whether I've yet been able to induce him to visit Devon. We're hoping that he will do so in the new year, because we are likely to have a Dartmoor forum, which he and I have already spoken about, in connection with an important development for the management of Dartmoor, which was the Fursdon Review and its implementation. And I will speak of those in due course. But to set the scene, Sir Mark, if I may, in 2022, farming's economic output in Devon was valued at £1.369 billion. Over 20,000 people are employed in farming in Devon on over 1.2 million acres of farmland. By far the largest proportion of those acres are held and worked by a modest-sized family farms of between 200 and 400 acres. No farming families in Devon continue in farming to grow rich. Devon's farms are principally grazing livestock and dairy farms. They do it, Sir Mark, because it is a way of life and because of the pride they take in producing some of the finest food and produce on the planet. And they also do it because for many, even most of them, their families have farmed in that place and within those communities for generations. The names of their forebears, engraved on the tombstones of their churches and their chapels, bear witness to the continuity of which they are the stewards and custodians. And it is that value, Sir Mark, something precious to the entire rural fabric of Devonshire, that is what I want to speak of most acutely and strongly today to the Minister. There is a preciousness about farms, many of which have herds that may have been looked after and developed over dozens of years, sometimes even a century. And all of that cultivation, all of that nurture, all of those traditions which those farming families represent. Often a farm will support not simply one family, but several. I know of many surrounding me, and I should say, Sir Mark, straight at the beginning, I would refer the house to my entry in the register. Although I do not farm, I have farmland in Devon, and I may well be a beneficiary, depending on the SFI's vagaries, in a modest way, of those schemes. And so I should tell the House, and I should tell the Minister in candour, that before I substantively start. But what I am familiar with are my neighbours, my friends, those who farm near me and around me and throughout the whole of Torridge and Tavistock that I have the honour to represent. And I know that those farms sustain sometimes not just one family, as I've said, but several. There may be 2 brothers or 3 brothers with their families. There may be children on those farms, hoping in due course to have the opportunity of farming themselves. And they don't farm, as I've said, to grow rich. They farm for the reasons that I've given, but they also farm because they love that way of life, because they have grown used to it, and because they know they are following in the footsteps of their forebears, and because they are proud of the produce and the animals that they rear. And so that is why there is a special value in farming families and family farms in Devon. True it is that the produce is the most important thing of which they're most proud, but also they contribute to the fabric, the rural shows. The minister would love to come to the Clovelly show, to the Oakhampton show, to the Holsworthy show, to all of the shows that take place throughout the summer months in Devon. They are extraordinary events when people get together, not just the farmers, but the ancillary trades that depend on them, when they, in a convivial setting, discuss their industry and their trade, when they create the fabric of rural life that is so precious. But, Sir Mark, farm incomes have been falling. It's not a secret. The minister will be well aware of it. From time to time, farm gate prices, fortunately, have remained relatively buoyant. But in 2023 to 24, average farm business income for that year to the end of February 2024 was lower for all farm types except for specialist pig farms and specialist poultry farms. So almost all of the farms in Devon, except for those relatively rare exceptions, saw falling average business income. On dairy farms, following the two better years when farm gate prices were relatively buoyant, average farm business income was 68% lower, with a fall in the farm gate price of milk being the primary driver. On lowland grazing livestock farms, beef, sheep, average farm business income fell by nearly a quarter to £17,300. £17,300 average farm income. And for grazing livestock farms in less favoured areas, higher fixed costs were only partially offset by an increase in output at £23,500, which was 12% lower. But from those falling incomes must be deducted the living of those who work the land. Those do not take into account the unpaid labour of those who own those farms or tenant those farms. The families who live on them, sometimes, as I've pointed out, several families, must from that 17,300 or that 23,500 take their own living. And so we can see that the figures that we're speaking about, falling figures as they have been in the last year or more, are not figures which most people would regard as easy to live on, particularly for more than one person, for multiple families. These farming families, of course, have not only to live with the hardness of their way of life, but also with the unpredictability of the weather. They also, sadly, Sir Mark, live with a different kind of unpredictability, of a different kind of weather, the political weather. And I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said, Sir Mark, that I think probably those farmers in my constituency, and I suspect it's not much different from the rest of the county, regard the political weather as even more random and unpredictable these days than the weather itself. I mean no party political point, because I accept entirely that the weather under successive governments has always been relatively unpredictable. But recently, the weather has achieved a combination that could be described without too much poetic hyperbole as a perfect storm. We have had the budget's accelerated cuts to the basic farm payment, the D-link payments. It's true that the progressive reduction to the basic payment was introduced in 2021. It's perfectly true that across all farm types, the average net payment received was approximately, in the reference year, 23 to 24, approximately £18,300. But that was 21% lower than the year in 22-23. Nevertheless, that average of 18,300 still accounted, on average, for 40% of farm business income. In the meantime, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which includes, of course, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, is not replacing the income lost to farms. Considerable progress was made to improve those schemes under the last government this year. But across all farm types, net income from agri-environment activities, while it increased by an average of 14%, which is welcome, to £10,600 on average, it is by no means sufficient to replace the 40% of farm business income the basic farm payment still comprised in the year 23 to 24. And as a result of this budget, Sir Mark, family farms will now experience a further 76% cut this year in the de-linked or basic payment, with a cap of £7,200. For many families, that will represent a dramatic and unexpected reduction for which farm businesses have been unable to plan and which will require readjustment and inevitable retrenchment of investment and employment. The payments will, of course, and were always intended to, reduce progressively over the next 3 years. But farmers were entitled to believe that they would be reduced proportionately. But instead, what the Chancellor of the Exchequer has done is reduce it by 76% against the reference year in a manner wholly unexpected to the industry. And that has meant, and cumulatively, Sir Mark, I will describe additional problems, that there has been an inability to plan, an inability to adjust one's cash flow. Halfway through potential investments on your farm, you find the income you expected to have is not the income you will have. And that is unhelpful. And at the same time, the Countryside Stewardship Higher Tier scheme has been postponed. It is said possibly until mid-2025. I'd invite the Minister to give us his view of when that scheme will be available. And the new expanded SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, for 2024 does not appear to be readily available to all farmers, particularly to upland farmers, who have had so far very little access to that scheme. The Countryside Stewardship Higher Tier and the SFI 24 offered some prospect with the activities that are now coming on stream, or will do, because I understand that some of the endorsed activities are still not ready. They offer some prospect of mitigating the dramatic losses that the budget has imposed on them. But the postponement has been a serious blow. They are marooned in legacy schemes that are being extended in mirror agreements, which cannot conceivably make up or mitigate the loss of direct payments that they are suffering because of the unexpected reductions. The Ministry has also suddenly halted capital grants. The sudden closure of the capital grant applications has been a huge shock. Farmers are being asked to adopt measures to improve the environment, but have been left without access to the very grant schemes which will enable them to do so and help with their cash flow and their productivity. With applications timed specifically to fit in with the farming year and their enterprise activities, and no confirmation that all applications already in the system will progress, further uncertainty is caused to these businesses. Will the Minister give us his comments on that? I saw him, in his characteristically civil and polite way, gently shake his head. Nothing would alight the hopes of those I represent today than if that gentle shake of the head meant something, meant that we were wrong to say that the capital grants had been ceased, meant that all of those writing to me, and I'm sure to my colleagues on all sides of the House, saying, what do we do now, have been living in an unnecessary nightmare. So I implore the Minister, if that gentle shake of the head meant anything, let us hear it now. Let us hear him boldly strike out and say, the capital grants will be resumed. They will not be postponed or delayed to 2025. Some relief is available to those who desperately need it. Because they too, the very farming families of whom I speak, will also be affected by increases in the employer's national insurance, contributions, in the minimum wage, and in all of the various measures, some of them quite small, which the budget has taken in connection with those pursuing family farming. But in the meantime, like a slow and steady drumbeat, gathering force behind the ever more implausible rhetoric of support, they see and hear the concrete commitments of this government. They witness it in action, not in words. They see how the Prime Minister at COP29 committed himself to a target of climate change, perfectly reasonable thing, some may argue it was. But in committing to that target, the Climate Change Committee has told him that he will need to reduce the consumption of meat and dairy products by 20% over the coming 5 years. These are the signs of the political weather. So are the small measures, as I've said, the small signs that beyond the talk indicate the revealed preferences and priorities of a government. It's not what the Prime Minister says when he stands at the podium and speaks to the National Farmers Union. We have already learned that we cannot trust that. What we realise, and what those listening this afternoon have begun to realise, that it is in the small measures and the large that the government is revealing its visceral and real preferences and priorities. Small things. The reclassification of double cab pickup trucks might have even been missed in the budget, squirreled away in the books, in the small print, was a lancet aimed straight at hundreds of farming families in Devon, all of whom, or many of whom, have the double cab pickup truck. And now it is no longer deductible. It is to be not treated as a business expense simply because it has a back seat, when for years it has been so treated by the revenue. These small measures reveal the real preferences and priorities of a government. It's not the words or the rhetoric or the talk. It's what you do by which you are judged. And of course, all of those measures are outweighed by far by the subject that tomorrow's debate will no doubt cover: agricultural and business property relief. The government's figures on this have now been widely discredited. The £1 million cap is not only on agricultural property relief, but also on business property relief. Both reliefs are used when a farm is passed to the next generation. As agricultural land prices have increased, a 200-acre farm, let alone a 400-acre farm, will almost certainly have a capital value on the land alone of more than £2 million. The same land that sustains often multiple families, the brothers, the sisters, the cousins, all of whom farm that land, and who from that exiguous amount of £17,300 or £23,500 in an upland area have to take their living, provide for their children, pay for their energy, and so on. So these farms are not wealthy. They are, as so often said, capital rich, asset rich, and income poor. It's said by the government that the relief is doubled for a couple. Bear in mind, however, that a farm will not just have the land. It will have other business assets. It will have equipment. It has livestock, all of which requires the business property relief to be deployed. And the business property relief, combined with agricultural property relief, is now capped at £1 million. It's said the relief is doubled for a couple, as I've said. But what about the 46%, Sir Mark, of farms owned by a single owner? If their spouse, for example, has already died, they cannot inherit the allowance from their deceased husband or wife. The 46% of single owners of farms will receive no double relief, only the million. And what is particularly wrong about this, I say to the Minister, and I say to you, Sir Mark.
There's a division, so the sitting is suspended
15 minutes.
for 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Okay, and we'll add it on at the end, don't worry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Order. Seeing as everybody's returned, we can start a little bit earlier than we planned to. I call Sir Geoffrey Cox.
Thank you, Sir Mark. I was just dealing with the impact, although it will be debated in finer and greater detail tomorrow, of the changes to agricultural property and business property relief and the impact it will have on farming families. And just this morning, I was written to by a farmer in my constituency. She lives in Sheepwash, in Torridge, in Devon. She is, I hope she will not will forgive me for mentioning her age, because she is 86. She has a dairy farm, milking 250 cows. And as she says herself, the cows may well be worth £400,000. The young stock, another 250,000. Machinery, perhaps 250,000. And the buildings, the farm buildings in which the investment, toil and effort has been poured by the farm, those who've worked that farm for generations, perhaps worth £1 million in themselves. They may have a dairy parlour. It may be automated. It may well be able to milk 250 or even more cows these days. One can see them on the carousel going round. If the minister's ever been, I'm sure he has. I can show him them in my constituency. The cows come in, they get onto the carousel, they go round, they come off the other side, and they're milked. And these automated parlours are worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, and all of it would need to be offset against business property relief. A business property relief which has now been capped not only with the value of those buildings and those business assets, but also the land, which is 400 acres. To sell 20% of the herd to pay inheritance tax, as my constituent suggests, will not only severely deplete the profitability of the business that already operates on the wafer-thin margins of which we've spoken today, but it will also cripple herds that have sometimes had lavished upon them 100 years of husbandry. Closed herds, some of them. Animals prized for their pedigree and their quality. Prize winning at the local shows of which I've already spoken about to you, Sir Mark, and drawn the minister's attention to. But what she says next is the most compelling. At my age, I have very little time to plan. And even if I could give the farm away and survive the 7 years that were necessary, I can't, because I still need to retain a modest income from the business, because my pension provision itself is modest. And taking out life insurance, she says to me at the age of 86, well, that's a non-starter. These changes and the implications for my family greatly worry me. That, Sir Mark, is an understatement. Older farmers' health and well-being are seriously at risk as we come to see ourselves as an impediment to the future generation successfully having the farm passed on to them, preserved for their generation to cultivate, to nurture, and to develop. And so that is why it's not so much the cap, although the cap is in itself bad enough. It's the complete failure of the government to assess the impact on the basis of accurate figures, now widely discredited, those of the Treasury, and different, as we know, from those of the ministry in which the minister is a minister. And the complete failure to work out the impact it will have not only on the businesses but the people. A failure to consult them. A failure to understand how it will have an impact upon the rural fabric and communities which I have the precious honour of representing and speaking for this afternoon. It's the fact that there is no time for them to plan, that makes them feel, up and down the length of this country and throughout the towns and villages of Devon, that they may be the impediment to the next generation. And so the same for the dramatic and unexpected cuts in the D-Link payments. No impact assessment, no consultation, all sudden. It's these small details, as so often is the case, that reveal the real preferences and priorities of the government. Now, I want to come to bovine tuberculosis, because previously that disease, when I was first elected, ran riot throughout the countryside of Devon. Devon, and particularly West Devon and Torridge and parts of northern Devon, were some of the most densely infected areas of that disease in the entire country. And for years, we banged our head on the brick wall of policy made by a previous Labour government to understand that unless the wildlife reservoir was controlled as one instrument in unquestionably the need for many, including biosecurity, including the development of vaccination, including all of these instruments, you could not arbitrarily exclude the use of the one of controlling the wildlife. Because in Devonshire, in the hills and the fields of Devonshire, I have watched and seen as the badgers run between the legs of the cattle. One tiny infinitesimal measurement of badger urine can create the bovine TB disease in cattle. It is impossible to prevent the infected wildlife reservoir in badgers, and for that matter in deer, from infecting the cattle. And it is widely understood by the veterinary community in Devonshire that wildlife is a vector in the disease. And finally, in 2010, and I pay tribute, if I may, to my Liberal Democrat colleagues in the coalition government, who themselves agreed, alongside the Conservatives, to introduce, it took moral and political courage, to introduce that single instrument that the Labour government had declined to do for all those years. I well remember bringing Hilary Benn down to the village of Claughton on the borders of Cornwall and sitting him alongside 15 or 20 farmers to hear their experiences. And although Hilary, as ever, the right honourable gentleman was, as the minister is, both civil, urbane, courteous, mild, kind and polite, he was implacable in his refusal to adopt the rational proposal that was being made by those farmers to him, which is that targeted, necessary control of wildlife, all wildlife, must in the end be controlled. And that control has led, in Torridge and Tavistock, to a 55% reduction in herd breakdowns. 55%. The chief vet himself says that it has been a causative factor of the downward trajectory of the disease. And I applaud the minister, if I may, for denouncing that there will be a refreshment of the bovine eradication strategy and that there will be no immediate cessation of this important instrument, an instrument that must be used judiciously and an instrument that can only be part of a wider group of instruments designed to bear down on the disease, but which cannot itself be excluded. My worry, let me say to the Minister now, about bovine TB, and I sat on the DEFRA Select Committee in the first 5 years of my election here that wrote the report that set the scene for the policy that the coalition government introduced. My worry is that this refresh will prejudge the outcome, that it is already announced that it will cease to use that instrument after this Parliament or at the end of this Parliament. That sounds like prejudging. It does not sound like evidence-led political decision-making. It sounds like an ideological decision, not an evidence one, when even the chief vet himself accepts that it has been a contributory factor in the downward trajectory of the disease. And in my constituency, and I suspect in the constituency of others here, it has led to a dramatic fall in the incidence of this disease, unquestionably, 55%. And I recall vividly that I could walk from one end of my constituency to the other on infected farms under restrictions. It is now quite impossible to do that. And that is a significant progress, because the human impact of bovine TB, you know, you don't need pyres 300 foot tall, as we had in Foot and Mouth in Devon.
Order. Could I remind the member that there are other members present who may wish to speak in the debate as well, and unless he winds up his remarks fairly soon, they're not going to have very much time at all.
I will indeed, Sir Mark.
Sir Geoffrey Cox.
You don't need pyres 200 foot tall to be able to see the invisible toll of slaughter and carnage that cattle slaughter after bovine TB entails. And so I urge the Minister to remain open-minded. Now, finally, it brings me to the Thurston review. And once again, I say to the Minister, who must, if I may say, none of my remarks, and I know he will understand this, are intended to be personal. On the contrary, the Minister is a reasonable interlocutor with whom it is always a pleasure to deal, who has always consulted on matters of constituency and other regional importance, and the Thurston review is one of them. I would urge him to implement the recommendations in full of the Thurston review. They were superbly conducted. It has been an extraordinary valuable example and exercise of how light can be brought to difficult situations. I applaud the appointment of the chairman of the Landscape Management Working Group. Thank you to the Minister, I say, if I may be permitted to say, Sir Mark. That is good. I invite him to come to Tavistock for the next Dartmoor Forum, where we have several hundred attending. The NFU, all of the environmental groups will come, Devon Wildlife, because that is an important moment when the actors and the players and those involved on Dartmoor can see how this government is engaged, as the last one was, in finding solutions to the uplands problem on the moor. And so, Sir Mark, I conclude with this plea. If this is not an intentional weather creation that leading farmers up and down the country and throughout Devon to believe that this government has no interest, no regard, no care, and is in fact callous and indifferent to their welfare and fate, then it is up to the Minister today and henceforth to change that weather by sending the correct signals. I have to say he will have a hard job, an uphill battle, to persuade them after the inheritance tax relief and the other measures of which I've spoken. But if anybody can do it in this government, it's the Minister. I hope he will, and I wish him success in doing so.
Right, can I just indicate to backbenchers that obviously because of the limitations of this debate, each person should aim for around 5 minutes if that's possible. Thank you. I call Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Sir Mark, it's a pleasure to speak in this debate. Can I first of all thank the honourable member for Tories in Tavistock for introducing the debate and for giving us a chance to be here. I suppose when I look forward to this debate, I'm conscious of the key issues that affect farmers across this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. One of those things is the food security of this nation. I will refer to the inheritance tax for family farms in a minute, but I want to say how important it is to have food security, how important it is to be able to feed our people. And for that to happen, we need to have farms that are viable, farmers who are working, and to ensure that opportunity is there. The similarities between Devon and Strangford, and indeed across this great United Kingdom, are real. Farming is the same no matter what the numbers of acres may be, and I know that the farms in Devon will be bigger than the farms back home, but nonetheless the issue is the same. And the one thing that the right honourable gentleman referred to, and it's really important, I think, Sir Mark, and that's that my farmers, my neighbours, those people who understand farming and who have lived farming all their life, those people understand that farming and land is more than that. It's the very lifeblood that's in their bodies and what they do. I declare an interest as a member of the Ulster Farmers Union, as the sister organisation of the NFU and the holder of a family farm. But I do highlight that holdings will be one of the very few that falls slightly under the threshold for this generation at least. And I speak wholly on behalf of those who have contacted me, those across this great United Kingdom, when they referred to the discounted inheritance tax comes into being. Falling revenues, profits ploughed back into the farms, farms very clearly asset rich but pound poor. The farmers' inheritance tax will impact. I know the Minister, and he's a decent man. I mean that not in any way. I mean that genuinely. There's not one of us in this room don't see him as a friend. But the fact is, what's been put forward is something that's alien and will affect the farms right across this great United Kingdom. The option for many farmers, as they tell me, will be the 20% tax as a sale of the land, and that would lessen the production, the very production that we need to have to be able to feed this great nation. And even with the future planning, would have less land to attempt to make more money to ensure that there was cash available for their sons to take over the farm, and the vicious circle starts again. The national insurance contributions impact upon all businesses, whether it be farmers, whether it be small businesses, whatever it may be. I was talking to farmers back home a week before last. Two of them are in the food production, Sir Mark, and the point that they made to me was clear. The national insurance contributions will impact upon each farm, will impact upon each business, and farmers will, and selling their product on, that price will go up. And who ultimately falls for the national insurance contributions? The ordinary man on the street. It affects everyone. So it's not just the farmers themselves. And the farmers told me that they see a 15 to 20% increase in food prices over the next period of time. Again, an indication of just how important it is. One of the farmers tell me he had a farm consisted of 2 holdings, and which 2 brothers managed. These men are still farming in their 70s. Again, the impact upon them. And again, the right honourable member referred to that, a single person on the farm or a duo on the farm, and the cost. Both of these boys now said there's no point in continuing the farm. That's the sons, because even though they have a job outside, the impact will be great upon them. The fact is that small farm holdings, whether it be in Devon, whether it be in Strangford, whether it be anywhere in this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, will be impacted greatly by what the government are bringing forward. And in Northern Ireland, obviously, we have other issues which are more important, but not for this debate, because I'll save that until tomorrow. I have a meeting next Monday with the Secretary of State for DEFRA, and meeting him and the Ulster Farmers Union to discuss the very issues that are before us today. And we will be discussing in detail the impact upon farmers in Northern Ireland, where 70% of farmers will be clearly impacted by this inheritance tax. When they sell off the assets, they sell a premise of a family farm. In a short space of time, the loser will be every child in this country who depends on imports for their food security. This cannot be, and I stand with the honourable members here and begging for a rethink. We aren't selling family silver, we're selling plots of potatoes, and without a harvest, we will all bear the brunt. Thank you.
Thanks. I call Rebecca Smith.
Mark. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate, which my neighbour, Sir Geoffrey, member for Torridge and Tavistock, brought forward. We have some farms that were once in his constituency that are now in mine, so he may well recognise some of the stories that I will be mentioning this afternoon. I think he's done me a favour. I've now got a speech for tomorrow as well as this afternoon, so I've taken some chunks out and we'll just focus on a couple of key issues. But I am going to take the opportunity to speak directly about Devon whilst the Minister is here, because clearly tomorrow there's going to be a lot of voices in the farming debate. So in my constituency of South West Devon, we've actually got 3 types of landscapes, I suppose, if you want to generalise, in terms of the kind of rural area that we've got. We've got land-based lowlands, we've got coastal lowlands, and then we've also got the uplands, the less favoured areas and protected landscapes up on Dartmoor as well. And each of those present their own challenges and opportunities and require kind of special ways of farming. And that's one of the values, I believe, of family farming, is that you have that legacy that is passed down from generation to generation. You can share the stories and keep those farms going. And what I find most, I suppose, exciting about the constituency is that each of those farms have got now farmers that are kind of my generation, so 40s and 50s. Their parents are still alive in their 80s, but ultimately we've got those kind of long-term family farms who are eager to keep doing their bit, to keep Devon looking like Devon, because I think it's worth saying that without our farmers, Devon would stop looking like Devon, because we need that rural landscape to complement the cities that we've got as well. So all of those are different farms. They're all family farms, and they have overlapping challenges. And I think it's just worth briefly touching on those shared challenges. Our farms are generally smaller than they are in the rest of the southwest, let alone the rest of the country. So the average farm size in Devon is 16% smaller than the southwest, which is then in turn 34% smaller than across the country, which means there are tighter profit margins, which mean when we shout about the agricultural property relief, for example, and the capital grants programmes, it's because those farms are already tightly run as it is. We are not the wealthy southeast, we are the southwest, and in particular, we are Devon. And they're also more likely to be tenanted than owned, owned than tenanted, which is also more unusual than the rest of the country. In terms of the agricultural property relief, just briefly on that, I want to just mention that given the fact that we do have many ageing parents who have assumed that their children, who are already often involved in the farm, if not having already taken over, it's been a given that those farms would just be passed down. And so actually you do have a generation of nearing middle-aged people who have expected to be able to farm into the long term, who are now quite rightly worried about what that is going to look like, both for them and for their children. But whilst I've got you here, Minister, if I may, Sir Mark, I want to just talk specifically about the uplands that are part of my constituency now and that have formed part of Sir Geoffrey's as well. And I've spent a lot of time with one particular farm, Greenwell Farm, a fantastic farmer, Matt Cole, who is absolutely passionate about upland farming and farming on Dartmoor and recognises what opportunity he has there. But he's got some key questions around land that is designated as moorland permanent grassland pasture, which currently falls through the funding gap. And whilst it's better for the environment and the soil not to disturb it, you often only get more funding if you do something to that land. And the nature of Dartmoor, as has been referenced in the Fursdon review, is different. He's keen to see if a role can be played for heritage grassland and whether we could look at a classification for that. And the Elms Moorland SFI offer as well, a real challenge there in terms of the livestock numbers. Under the HLS, they could have 0.3 livestock units per hectare. Under the SFI 21, that's dropped to 0.16 per hectare. To decrease livestock numbers unlocks those SFI options, but stocking rates don't represent the land stock on Dartmoor if we lower them down, and it doesn't enable us to do what we need to do in that landscape to protect it. So where has DEFRA got, if I may ask, on the moorland stocking rates, and in particular looking at how we can do that? Dartmoor farmers are calling for flexibility on those stocking rates to reflect the findings of the Dartmoor review. And just a couple more points, if I may, Sir Mark, to finish. The key question for upland farms is also the fact that DEFRA has promised a working group on uplands specifically to look at this going forward, and there's a key question about what progress has been made on that, if I may set that to you as well. And then just finally, the other point, particularly around the coastal and lowlands bits of my constituency, lots of other organisations that feed into what the farms are doing with DEFRA, such as the West Country Rivers Trust and also the South Devon National Landscapes, all of whom receive money from DEFRA through other funding pots, all of which are under threat. And so my final point would just be that the plea, I believe, from the farmers that I've met in the last few weeks is just the need for joined-up thinking. The fact that when we reduce one pot, let's say, for the South Devon National Landscape, that has another impact on farmers who might be struggling with their SFI funding, and they're keen to ensure that they can produce, protect the environment, feed the nation, create and sustain good jobs, and generate economic growth. And we can't do that unless they're allowed to get on with the job that they're keen to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Richard Ford.
Thank you, Sir Mark, and it is an honour to serve under your chairship. And also I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Torridge and Tavistock, who I feel could probably have spoken on this subject for another half an hour with plenty more to add. And we note his experience as a landowner himself. I want to highlight in my contribution the plight of people in Mid and East Devon who I represent, who are feeling a great deal of uncertainty about the future. And I want to do that through the lens of a couple of examples. Firstly, there is a family farm in Columpton, near Columpton. They've been farming in, well, I'll read direct from what they've sent me, in fact, because their words are quite touching. We have been farming within a 5-mile radius for over 400 years. Unfortunately, the family had to sell the farm in the 1860s at the start of the Great Agricultural Depression. It has taken us 150 years to regain ownership of the farm, and now the inheritance tax issue threatens us with the risk of losing it again. I think that just illustrates that we're not talking here about some short-term business enterprise that gets started up and fades as if it were some sort of digital business. This is a livelihood that goes down the generations. It's not about the capital or the assets. It's about the hard graft of the people who do it. The legacy of the last government that the Right Honourable Member for Torridge and Tavistock touched on is worth pointing out. And I think the cuts to the basic payment was one aspect to that. Another was, of course, the Australia and New Zealand trade deal, which the government's own figures found had cost farming £94 million. So this proposed change to inheritance tax is but one more thing on top of a really torrid time that farmers have had in recent years. And I mean, my appeal to the Minister when he comes to address us at the end of the debate is whether he might please take a look at this, because we're talking here about a Treasury benefit of perhaps £500 million in a budget of £40 billion of new taxes being raised. This is a small sum for the Treasury in Whitehall, but it will have enormous impact in the countryside. I'd like to talk about another example, that of the Derryman family. Peter, his brother, and now his son. They're in many ways emblematic of the sort of people who I represent from Mid and East Devon. They represent thousands of farming families working really hard graft day and night and contributing to the local societies, the economy in Stockland. But they're really very concerned. They only own 120 acres, and so you might suppose that they wouldn't fall subject to a tax that is proposed on only the first £1 million of combined farm and business assets. But actually, when you look at the value of the farmhouse, of the machinery, if you take into account the land, the livestock, this all adds up to potentially an inheritance tax liability. The government claims that 73% of farms will not be affected, and yet the NFU claims that 7 in 10 farms will be impacted. These figures cannot both be right. And when I was lobbied on the 19th of November by people who I represent, they asked me to say to the Minister, what we should be seeking to do here is to discriminate between the genuine farmers and the hobby farmers. And we know that there has been a tendency to use land as an inheritance tax dodge. The genuine farmers who spent the day in London, very unusually for them to have to put down their tools and come to London, but they came here to say there has to be a way to discriminate between those people who've just bought a few cows as a tax dodge and those people who earn their living from the land. The reality is that these people are working unsociable hours, they're physically exhausted, and sometimes mental health issues have plagued them. And I've had constituents talk to me about how this tax is cruel because there are 17 months between now and it being introduced in 2026, and people are reflecting on what they might have to do to try to dodge that tax, to avoid that tax before it is introduced. In concluding, I would say to the Minister, we're not allowed to use props in this debate, but there is a photo in front of me here that was given to me by Peter Derryman. It's of his granddaughter. It's of his young granddaughter with a prize lamb at a show in Devon. Whatever the technicalities, this is a matter of the heart. Thank you.
I call Dr. Danny Chambers.
Thank you for calling me to speak, Sir Mark, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I want to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Torridge and Tavistock for securing this really important debate. I actually grew up on a family farm in Devon, very near where the member for Torridge lives, and I have, as a vet, attended and been on duty for many of the shows the agricultural shows that he talked about. And if he hasn't been to the Chagford sheep shearing competition yet, it's definitely worth, I definitely recommend it. And I'd like to extend an invitation to him to come to the Alresford show near Winchester, which is a fantastic agricultural show, been going on for over 120 years. And what we're just touching on in all these speeches is that farming, it's not merely a business, but the rural community is based upon family farms. You know, they're not just farming, they're not just producing food, they're also the governors for the local schools, they're also doing charity work, and we need to keep family farms farming to ensure that the entire fabric of our rural communities survive and thrive going forward to the next century. And this farming is a tough life. It's one of those jobs, it's one of those professions where you can work all hours, in all weathers, and then, due to reasons completely out of your control, realise that you're going to either make money or lose a huge amount of money. And these can be due to, weather conditions, it can be droughts, floods, it can also be due to disease outbreaks, and we've had foot and mouth, we've had blue tongue, there's avian influenza, it can also be due to political events, as everyone has touched on, trade deals. And you can do everything right in 1 year, and then because of reasons completely out of your control, you then realise that you're going to be struggling to make profit that year and maybe make a significant loss. And what has been well recognised and was touched on by my honourable friend for Honiton and Sidmouth is the mental health issues that are in rural communities at the moment. We know farmers that are dealing with this uncertainty do struggle with a high level of suicide. And when we're talking about farming, we have to remember that these are not just businesses, but very much individuals and families that are directly affected by everything, decisions that are made in this House. This apologise, it's the member for South West Devon, I was trying to remember the name of your constituency. You touched on how beautiful the Devon countryside is, and certainly it's, if we look at the lakes, the Lake District, if we look at the Yorkshire Dales, if we look at the Shires in Devon, if we look at the beautiful countryside we have around Hampshire and around the Meon Valley, it only looks the way it does because it has been farmed for generations. And this is a curated landscape where generations of people have created this landscape and they've cared for it and they're custodians of this landscape. And although farmers might not make a direct profit from tourism, the only reason we have such a booming tourism industry is because we have the landscape that we've got, and it should be recognised the contribution they make to the huge amount of our GDP that's down to foreign visitors coming to look at our green and pleasant land. I was attending the APPG earlier today on food security, and there was a discussion on illegal meat imports coming in through Dover. And we hear how the Port of Dover authorities and border control have and DEFRA have a struggle for resources. And so when they do spot checks on lorries bringing in products, it turns out that they're quite regularly picking up tons and tons of illegally imported meat. Now, not only is this a public health concern because we don't know the origin of it, we don't know what standard it was produced to, it's often not been refrigerated, but it's also possible, because a lot of these these lorries are coming in from Eastern Europe, where there are notifiable diseases of livestock, like foot and mouth, like pesta pitti ruminant, that we don't see in the UK, and this is a huge risk to agricultural livestock production and farming in the UK. And so I'd ask the Minister for his comments on how we can better resource our border security and our biosecurity, because I'm fully aware that this costs a huge amount of money and resources, but equally it is much more cost effective to prevent a foot and mouth disease outbreak and other typical, similar diseases than it is to actually deal with an outbreak. And that's a hugely concerning situation we're in at the moment. I know that farmers and vets are hugely proud that we have the highest animal welfare standards in the world and the highest environmental standards in the world when it comes to farming. And I know that farmers and vets were hugely disappointed when the last government I'll just wrap up my comments here. Okay.
So remind the member, who I know is a new member, that if you don't arrive before the mover moves the motion in future, you won't be called to speak. Okay. We now move to front bench contributions. I call Caroline Vaughan.
Thank you, Sir Mark. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I would like to begin by thanking the Right Honourable Member for Torridge and Tavistock for securing this important debate today and for his lyrical introduction to the subject. It's very clear from all the members who've contributed that there is much at stake at the moment for our rural economy. In Devon, family farms are an essential part of our community and the economy, as they are elsewhere, and I refer to the contributions from the members for Strangford and Winchester who have talked about their own areas as well. But in Devon, farms cover 1.2 million acres of land and employ over 20,000 people. Agriculture is a backbone of our local economy. From grazing livestock to growing crops, Devon's farmers produce not just food, but they also produce the very character of our rural landscape. The Right Honourable Member for Torridge and Tavistock spoke of the preciousness of our farms and the decades of heritage that we are rightly very proud of. However, the government's changes to inheritance tax and agricultural property relief are very concerning. The government claims that 73% of farms will be unaffected by these changes. However, as the NFU has pointed out, these figures are based on historical claims and they fail to account for the current state of the agricultural sector. For example, 66% of farms in England have a net value of over £1 million, and 42% of farms are over 50 acres, meaning that many of these farms will now be above the £1 million threshold. The burden that this will place on farmers cannot be overstated, especially given the other financial pressures that they have faced over the past few years. Struggling with skyrocketing costs, energy and feed prices have risen due to the invasion of Ukraine. Many of them are still reeling from the Conservatives' botched trade deals that have further stressed the farming community. And the recent increase in national insurance contributions and the impending carbon tax on fertiliser further compound these challenges. So I would just like to read to the Minister some quotes from local farmers that we have surveyed, 86% of whom say they will be hit by this tax, and 50% of which are not owned by a couple, so they already lose out on a chunk of the potential tax relief. We are now in the process of winding down all investment and food production on this farm in response to the budget. Producing food is difficult and carries a lot of financial risk. We will keep farming, but at a much lower level. This doesn't sound like growth to me. Our farming income for the last 2 financial years has been at a loss, mainly due to the weather. It feels so hard. This policy just knocks the confidence out. The policy, as it currently stands, will halve food production in a generation. Through previous governments, we have been encouraged to diversify in order to augment our farm income and stay afloat. Now we feel we'll be penalised for this, as we have added value to our farm, which will now be liable for inheritance tax. I feel completely let down and saddened. This will completely destroy the rural community. Farmers will be forced to sell land that has been in their families for generations, the very tool by which they produce food and earn a living. The Minister is shaking his head, but every single farmer I have spoken to says this is the case. The idea that neighbouring farmers or tenant farmers will just buy up this land is a fantasy. Most won't be able to afford it, and land may well end up being bought by non-farming companies with no interest in food production, but rather in carbon offsetting or potential development. One family now faces the prospect of having to sell at least a quarter of their assets, including tractors, sheep and land, just to pay the tax. And they tell me that rather than investing and growing their business, they are now having to wind down their farm with a view to reducing their future tax liabilities. This is a deeply worrying trend, as it could lead to a broad contraction of the sector, harming not just farmers, but the entire agricultural industry. The Liberal Democrat position is clear. This tax will disproportionately harm the farming community, and we call for the government to rethink it. But it is not just farmers. The impact on rural businesses that rely on the farming economy, such as vets, agricultural merchants and machinery suppliers, will be severe. Local suppliers of agricultural machinery and heavy equipment are already facing a significant increase in costs due to national insurance changes. These businesses are vital to the farming economy, and again, a contraction of the sector will have a ripple effect throughout the entire rural economy. It's also crucial to note that the DEFRA budget for day-to-day spending is set to drop by 1.9% over the next 2 years, and the pause on capital grants is yet another worry, particularly for farmers who are doing their best to comply with environmental measures such as safe slurry storage. If the grants aren't available to do this work, it makes sustainable farming even harder to achieve. The Sustainable Farming Incentive, which should be providing support to farmers, has proven unworkable for many, and the transition from basic payments to ELMS has been complicated and unnecessarily slow, an indication of the lack of foresight and planning that was done by the previous government in preparation for a potential withdrawal from the EU. Even though I am no fan of Brexit, a situation that could have brought a real boost to both British agriculture and the environment has been a bureaucratic mess and a clear sign of how rural communities are so often the lowest priority for government. Talking of environmental payments, I would just like to take a quick moment to underline how important it is for the government to make these schemes work. Unless we restore the health of our soils and the biodiversity that has been decimated across the UK, our farmers will find it harder and harder to produce quality food. If we are to mitigate flooding, increase water quality and combat carbon emissions, we simply must do this work. And as both the honourable members from Devon have referred to this, it's really important on Dartmoor, a small part of which also falls into my constituency. It's a complex conversation about farming, stocking levels and the SSSIs, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to try and find some solutions. Environmental payments are fundamental to the future of good food production. Lower inputs are good for everyone, both nature and the farmer's back pocket. It's not an either-or, farming or the environment. We simply have to make this work. Finally, Mr. Chair, I will finish with sharing something deeply troubling that I heard from local farmers in my constituency when they came to Westminster last week. Some talked about the need to hide shotguns to prevent older owners of the family farm from taking their own lives before the inheritance tax changes come into force. They now feel that they are worth more dead than alive because of the burden these taxes would place on their families. And the Honourable Member for Honiton Sidmouth also touched on this. We know that poor mental health is rife in the farming community already, and this sudden tax change has placed an added pressure which could prove fatal. No farmer should ever feel that their legacy and livelihood are so threatened that it would drive them to such despair. In response to these challenges, the Liberal Democrats are calling for a £1 billion increase in the farming budget and for the government to reverse its decision on APR. We understand the importance of ensuring that family farms can continue to operate and thrive. Family farms are not only vital for our food security and the preservation for our rural environment, but they are also central to the history and heritage of our country. The Liberal Democrats will continue to fight for the future of family farming to ensure that our rural communities thrive and to make sure that farmers' voices are heard loud and clear in Westminster. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now for the official opposition, I call Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Sir Mark, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I begin by first congratulating my right honourable friend, the member for Torridge and Tavistock, for securing this incredibly important debate. Devon is one of the farming heartlands of England, and the rolling fields that are so familiar to tourists and locals alike are dutifully managed by Devon's family farmers over generations upon generations, producing the highest quality of produce. The county is renowned for its diversity of farming, with a strong mix of dairy, beef and sheep, some arable, accompanied by many a farm diversification. Yet, despite this, we know that across the whole of the South West, an average farm income is approximately 30,000 less than the national average. It is vital, therefore, that the government supports these farms, supports the family farmer to continue to deliver high-quality food produce and maintain our countryside for the future. Now, an area that the government and I can find common ground on is the money released via the budget to improve biosecurity facilities at Weybridge, which will help combat challenges posed by blue tongue and other diseases. It is, of course, vital for farmers in Devon and across the country that we tackle any diseases and their threats early, not only to protect livestock, but also to prevent costs spiralling out of control as a result of a fully fledged outbreak. But unfortunately, that's where the common ground ends. Since the budget, the government have chosen to levy a shattering series of changes on farmers, changes which create uncertainty, a failure to raise the overall farming budget, a failure that amounts to a real terms cut in funding. The rapid and unexpected delinking of payments from the basic payment scheme will see huge drops in the money received by farming businesses as soon as next year. And for many farms, this change in their financial forecasting will be devastating, with long-term plans scuppered as government support is pulled out and from underneath them. Likewise, we are still waiting for the government to outline its transition process from the legacy higher-level stewardship schemes, and whilst such schemes have been extended by a year, many farmers are still unable to look beyond this term, as they do not know what the government will expect of them as they move towards the sustainable farming incentive. Indeed, many farmers that I have spoken to are deeply frustrated that the equivalent SFI options to HLS options have higher payment rates, but yet this Labour government has made a choice not to enable those locked into HLS agreements the ability to easily transfer into the equivalent SFI. And then we heard just last week the sudden closure of capital grant schemes, causing deep frustration, deep confusion to many applicants. And let's not forget that these capital grant funds for farmers were to deliver environmental outcomes, not only to improve their efficiency within their business, but yet this funding has been slashed. So farmers and growers are being asked to adapt and adopt measures to improve the environment, but have been left in the lurch by this Labour government without access to key grant schemes which will enable them to do just this. So only a month ago, we were shocked to hear plans to accelerate the phase-out of direct payments, and yet, just last week, we've heard the decision by the government to remove the capital grants. How on earth is a farming business able to forecast their certainty and forecast their plans? There is also the increased direct costs expected, such as the carbon tax on fertiliser, estimated to increase the cost of fertiliser by £50 a tonne, which will undoubtedly have a direct impact on the cost of food and a consequential food inflation on prices. And then, of course, in the budget, we heard the increase in employers' national insurance, coupled with the reduction in associated threshold, an increase in the minimum wage, the double cab pickup tax. I could go on. But of course, the biggest impact on our Devonshire farmers and farmers across the country will be Labour's family farm tax. The average size of a farm in the South West ranges around 200 acres. So if we take the points that the Right Honourable Member for Torridge and Tavistock quite rightly outlined by his constituent who was a dairy farmer, take the size of a dairy business coupled with its value associated with the farmland, 400 acres was referred to, and then the cost and the value of the dairy cows, machinery, feedstocks, not to mention the value of a farmhouse and indeed the value of the farm buildings, coupled perhaps with any farm diversification project that has been taken into account, we will almost certainly be over and above the cap of £1 million that this Labour government has chose to put in place that both applies to agricultural property relief and business property relief. And as I've already alluded to, farms in the southwest are even more cash-strapped than the national average. So for the many farmers across Devon, the only option under this Labour government through the implementation of their family farm tax will be to sell assets. But what assets do they sell? Put simply, this combined assault from all measures within the budget will be fatal for many farms right across the country. And that's why the Conservatives want to see this tax reversed. And we have forced a vote on this very issue in the main chamber tomorrow. And it's not surprising, perhaps, to not see one Labour MP contribute in this debate. And I only hope that Labour MPs, and indeed this Labour government, are listening to our British farmers and their constituents that have been raising these concerns time and time again since the budget. And that's why we've also pledged earlier this year to uprate and broaden the offering of SFI options. But we have heard from many farmers right across the country that they are unable to get into these new options at the speed of which the previous Conservative administration and which the new Labour administration seem to be giving out. And I can only conclude that the RPA are acting slowly to create a underspend next year for the spending review to see a slash in the farming budget next year. I hope that that is not the case, and maybe the Minister will be able to allude to the government's intentions. Sir Mark, I know for a fact that many of Devon's stalwart farmers will have been alongside not only myself but my fellow colleagues in Whitehall just a couple of weeks ago to protest against this government's shameful offering to farmers. And I just hope that the government was listening to their fury and their distress and the comments that have been made by all sides on this side of the House in this debate, because it matters. The implications on health and well-being matters, on mental health strain that has been put on our farming community. So I say to the Minister, listen carefully to what is being said to you, listen to the professional advisors out there, and I only hope that you will change course imminently.
I call the Minister, Daniel Zeigner.
Thanks, Sir Mark. It's always a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. And can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for Torridge and Tavistock for bringing this debate in his characteristically forceful way. He seduces, he charms, he flatters, and I particularly enjoyed his account of the centuries which is taken to produce the wonderful farms we see in Devon. Centuries, of course, which preceded the current agricultural property relief regulations. I also enjoyed his account of the weather that the previous government had created that left the farming sector in such a parlous state for the new government to inherit. But he also encouraged me to visit Devon, and I can tell him that actually I think within my first 10 days of being appointed as the Minister, I had actually made my way to Devon, as I had done in opposition on a number of occasions, and thoroughly enjoyed it, but also frequently heard from local people about how they were concerned about others coming to buy up land over the top of local people. So some of these issues, I suspect we can share our concerns. And of course, he referenced the excellent debate that he secured in this chamber last year on the future of Dartmoor, and I will come to that in the speech. Now, there have been many important points raised. I listened carefully to all the thoughtful contributions. I was particularly struck by the member from South West Devon and her comments, and we'll go away and look carefully at the points about the moorland stocking rates, which I know my officials are themselves looking closely at, and how it affects, I think, Greenwald Farm she was referring to. I always listen closely to the Honourable Gentleman from Strangford, and also from Honiston and Sidmouth, also made important points, and I was struck by the points made by the Honourable Member for Winchester, particularly around border controls. And I would just remind him that one of the first things we did was strengthen those controls, because I very much agree with him about the threats at the borders. Let me say, we absolutely recognise that the farming sector is vital. Family farms are crucial. They produce our food, they steward the environment, they look after nature. We are all indebted to farmers across this country for doing that, and we all recognise the stresses and strains, the mental health challenges, which again the Honourable Gentleman from Winchester mentioned, and of course the pressures from the weather and from disease in the last few years. But that's why this government is investing £5 billion into farming over the next 2 years, the largest amount ever directed towards sustainable food production, rural economic growth and nature's recovery in our country's history. And that should send a very powerful message to farmers about the value we place upon all that they do. And within that, we've committed £1.8 billion for environmental land management schemes, delivering improvements to food security, biodiversity, tackling carbon emissions, improving water quality, air quality and flood resilience. But let me address the point the Right Honourable Gentleman made at the beginning about basic payments. He's right, we are accelerating the end of the era of payouts to landowners simply for owning land. And the fastest reductions in subsidies will be to those who historically received the largest payments. For example, the 4% who received more than £100,000 in subsidies in 2020, next year, it is true, will receive no more than £8,000 in 2025. Whereas for the majority of farmers who receive less than £10,000 to start with, they will see a gradual reduction in their de-linked payments, but, and this is the key point, they will all have access to ongoing funding through SFI and other schemes. And that is the key point. We are speeding up that vital transition, which I fully recognise the previous government set about initially to get to a better place in terms of the environment. But on capital grants, this is interesting because there is no magic money tree, I have to say to the opposition. The reason the capital grants are stopped is because they're oversubscribed. We've seen an unprecedented demand this autumn. The Rural Payments Agency received more applications for capital grants from May to November 24 than over the whole of the 23-24 financial year. They're also worth more. The standalone capital grant applications, as at November 24, were up 45% compared to the whole of the last financial year. And this is a basic problem that we inherited. No management of public funds, which is the core problem the whole government faces with our inheritance from the Conservatives, and we will deal with those points. Now, let me turn to the Dartmoor issues, which the Right Honourable Gentleman rightly raised. On the 29th of October, we appointed Phil Stocker to chair the new Dartmoor Land Management Group, and that group was one of the central recommendations of the Fursdon Review. We're moving forward with David Fursdon's recommendations to create a long-term plan for land use, which preserves the cultural heritage of the area, recovers nature and boosts food production. And the Dartmoor Land Use Management Group will provide a space for stakeholders to discuss important issues and work to strike the right balance between food security and preserving the diversity and abundance of nature in the area. Mr Stocker will be responsible for steering the Land Use Management Group to meet its aims and objectives, and one of his first tasks will be to identify and appoint members who bring the necessary knowledge, expertise and engagement to the group, and that process is now underway. We expect that first meeting to take place very shortly. I absolutely hear the Right Honourable Gentleman's invitation, and certainly at an appropriate point I will be hopefully constructively visiting and supporting the work that's being done. I also understand that the Right Honourable Gentleman met with officials from Natural England in October to update him on progress with implementing the Fursdon Review, and we've been in discussion since I have taken up this role, and we wish the whole process well. Now, let me turn to the agricultural property relief issue. It's a well-rehearsed debate. It will be further debated in the main chamber tomorrow. I'm going to repeat the points that I've made before. We're confident the changes are proportionate and that smaller farms will be protected. Those above the threshold will have 10 years to pay the tax with zero interest incurred. No one's doubting this was a difficult decision. But the truth is the economic situation the government inherited has required us to make tough choices. So I would like to reassure members that in terms of the figures that we have, which are the only figures that we can go on which are actual claims on estates, we reiterate our point that we feel the vast majority of people will not be affected.
Will the Minister give way?
I'm happy to give way on that point.
Would the Minister just confirm, just on that point, whether or not in any analysis that the government did in relation to its impact on future claimants of IHT, whether or not they took into account the size of farming units when they brought in the cap of £1 million?
Well, this will be debated further, and it will be debated, the debate on my side will be led by Treasury Ministers who are in a better position to answer those kind of questions. What I will say is that the complexity and the difference of the very different range of setups and structures that family businesses have makes it very difficult to make that assessment. But also, the Honourable Gentleman will know that when it comes to legislation, there will be a full assessment, and we can look into those details then. But I stand by the figures the Treasury have given us, that we expect it will only affect around 500 claims for agricultural property relief in 26-27. So we believe this is a fair and balanced approach. I will.
Thank you for giving way. I would just like to ask the Minister whether the Treasury consulted DEFRA on this tax change before deciding to go ahead with it in the budget.
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that we are one government and we stand together. So we are going forward, picking up the mess that we inherited, and that is the problem. That is the problem we face. So on each of these issues in turn, we have to answer that basic question: who's going to fix the economic mess? And the answer is it's this government that fixes. Let me move to the double cab pickup tax, which the Honourable Gentleman.
Indulge me just for
one more.
Only because I understand I won't have the opportunity to do this at the dispatch box tomorrow, so if it's a Treasury Minister. Could the Minister just confirm, when carrying out an impact and you're introducing a cap of £1 million, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you did not, the government did not look at the size of family farms that will be impacted, and therefore surely, therefore, not understanding the value of an estate on death if you're not looking at the size of a unit, and therefore, how could you understand correctly the number of claimants that would be impacted?
We can, because we simply look at the figures in terms of the number of claims that have been made in the last few years, and that is how we arrive at that conclusion. Let me continue with the double cab pickup test.
This is a good way, just on that point, to the securer of the debate. The figures that the Treasury have published simply deal with those with the use of agricultural property relief. What they do not show is how many farms had already used their business property relief before needing to rely on agricultural property relief. So it doesn't take into account the fact that it's capping not just APR but BPR as well.
Well, I would refer the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, to the letter that the Chancellor sent to the Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, which goes into this in some detail, where it says, currently, of the population of effective states that claim both APR and BPR, almost a quarter of claims include a claim for shares on the alternative investment market. And I think that begins to show both the complexity and how this is not perhaps always as it seems. So I will continue to talk about the double cab pickup tax because, again, as I suspect the Right Honourable Gentleman knows, this was actually based on a legal judgment by the courts. We respect that judgment, as I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman would wish us to do, but we also generously are saying that it will not affect the capital allowances treatment of anyone who already owns a double cab pickup. Anyone already leasing a double cab pickup from their employer as a benefit in kind will have until April 2029 or until their lease expires before these changes will affect them. I'm conscious of time, Sir Mark, so I'll just briefly touch on bovine TB, hugely important subject, which of course has caused huge cost and also huge suffering for many, many farmers. As the Right Honourable Gentleman acknowledged, we started work on a new TB eradication strategy. The key part of that is pushing much more swiftly on developing a cattle vaccine, which I genuinely think is going to be the ultimate answer to this very, very difficult problem. And it very much builds on the evidence and conclusions of Sir Charles Godfrey's 2018 independent review. And alongside that, we'll be doing the first badger population survey in over a decade, developing a new national wildlife surveillance programme and establishing a new badger vaccinator field force. I genuinely think that we can work together on eliminating the scourge of bovine TB. So let me conclude, Sir Mark, by thanking all honourable members for what I think has been an informative debate. Always good to talk about what's happening in Devon, and let me reassure the House, I am absolutely committed, as my government, to a strong future for family farms and food producers across the country. I'm sure we will be continuing the debate.
Thank you. I call Sir Geoffrey Cox to wind up.
Thank you, Sir Mark. I could be quite concise. And may I thank the Minister, through you, Sir Mark, for, as ever, the polite, civil and gentle way in which he treats inevitable criticism that must come from this side of the House, some of it justified, no doubt some he thinks unjustified. I have to say I found his responses on inheritance tax changes pretty thin, but no doubt we'll hear tomorrow from the Treasury Ministers as they stand up for themselves on a decision that from his silence we, I think, can deduce. My Honourable Lady for South Devon asked a very pertinent question whether the DEFRA was consulted, and the answer did not come back yes. It came back, we are one government, which, if I've ever heard a piece of prevarication elegantly executed in this chamber, that was it. And that is the problem, that we all sense that this was a Treasury-driven, tin-eared, completely deaf to the real needs of the farming world and community, which I suspect even after the relatively short time the Minister has been in office, because he did serve in opposition, and I know he was an attentive, listening figure whilst in opposition. Even he must understand that this has caused a restiveness throughout the community, and not just a restiveness, a despair. The 86-year-old lady living in Shipwash, who now sees herself as an impediment to the passage of her ancient farm to her own children and grandchildren, is a human example of the impact. And it is not going to be comforted by the answer, well, only 27% of farms will be affected. She says, what about me? Can we afford, even on the Treasury figures, to lose 2,500 farms over this Parliament? Because even on the minuscule figure that the Treasury takes into account, it's still 2,500 farms that will be lost the length and breadth of England. I say we can't. 500 per year. I can't. We can't afford it. And so we will debate this tomorrow. I know my honourable friend will debate it forcibly, and the Minister will no doubt be relieved to be sitting by the side of Treasury Ministers who are going to have to take the rap for the mess that they have made. On bovine TB, I would like to work with the Minister on it. It's a disease that affects my constituency, as well as the constituencies of all of us in Devonshire, profoundly. We don't want to go back in history. I recall that history too well. I recall the foot and mouth pyres, but also, as I've said, the silent and invisible carnage that the slaughter of cattle as a result of bovine TB creates. The restrictions on dairy farms, on livestock grazing farms, these are cruel. Cruel not only to the animals, but to the people. And so we need together to find a solution. I have been told that vaccination was just a few years away every time I have had a debate of this type. It would be interesting to know how far the Minister thinks the vaccination is away, and has he solved the problems of exporting the milk and the produce once it's been vaccinated to our markets abroad? Because, of course, it's difficult to determine whether it's a vaccine or it's the disease. And it's not clear that our markets would be available. Those problems have to be resolved by him, and I'm very happy to work with him to do that. And finally, on the question of the Landscape Management Unit in the Thurston Review, may I urge him to recall that what is critical to the success is natural England's buy-in.
The motion is lapsed. We now move to the next debate.